Thanks, everyone. Sorry we're starting a bit late. So I'm going to talk about meta texts and experimentations in translation and how that can help us to think about language and community in relation to writing as well. I plan to start my talk with some key concepts from translation studies, why I consider them limiting. Like the other rules of creative practice, they're important to learn about, but they're also there to be broken if we are to move beyond to offer defamiliarized modes of reading, thinking, relating, which I think in a world where we have this overabundance of information and formulated expressions aimed at efficiency and productivity, this breaking away is even more important than before. The main concepts I was thinking about were the concept of fidelity to the original in translation, faithfulness to the author's text, and the translator's invisibility, like no trace of the translator in the translation. It's also just interesting, like when you go back to especially like the earlier theories of translation studies, there's a lot of like gendered language thinking about translation relationship, like the translator is usually a she, the author is a he, just this idea of like faithfulness, which is also like very limited definition of what faithfulness is, fidelity and all of that. But then I thought it would be nice to, instead of like dwelling on these concepts and like thinking about them, to just look at two examples of texts that I'm just drawn to for different reasons. And then I would just read two anecdotes from my own experiences of translating to just bring out other possibilities for us to think about translation. So the first text that I want to show is this queer Iranian poet who lives in Toronto, Hasher Mohammadi. They also go by Kes Mohammadi. And I'm gonna put this in the chat as well. So if you want, you can open the text on your own computer as well. I want to give you just a few moments to try to read this. This is a multilingual poem, but it's doing multilingualism in a very interesting way, going back and forth between Persian and English, working with the word wu, which in Persian is odor, and just like going through that. But there's an intention, and he just like disrupts the idea of like borders between languages and boundaries of languages. So just try to read for a bit. And then I want someone to actually volunteer to read if anyone is up to it. And it's okay to struggle with it and to stumble. Okay.
Permission to struggle, I'll do it. Odorless poem for Bardia Sine. Alas, who was the third one weeping? I thought we were only two. Hosan Panahi. Boo is smell, but boo is also in Budan, which is to be. Like the phrase be to budan, to be without you. But the Persian be means without be to, without you. The bu in Budan akin to English be, to be. But the Persian to means inside or in. And the Persian in means this. To be is illegible, but be to means no insides or empty. To be to. To be empty, endless. To be boo, to be odorless. To be two beings. To be into be two beings. People hollowed out into right here.
It goes on, but maybe we can just pause here. Anyone wants to speak to the original impulse, or like, how do you feel in your body, or what's the experience of, or reading that text actually?
Oh, I love reading it. I mean, the way that the speaker is kind of puzzling out, words in both Persian and English that have similar sonic attributes, but then there's divergence, of course, in meaning, or there's adjacent meaning, just all those different positions of language. I think that sense of without, when we see the borders kind of dropping, or a word Asiya and I have been talking about in workshop is just a kind of intensive porosity between beings, between words. And it was pleasurable to read. And words also become my own thinking about Gertrude Stein, but like words as like suddenly become objects, they sort of slip from representation into different degrees.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in a way, in the poem, a process of translation is happening, right? But what happens as you read on, even as someone who speaks both languages, you get kind of disoriented. You never know which language you're in. And sometimes I have to go back and read the italics because I've read them with the wrong pronunciation and it doesn't make sense, for example, in Persian. And it's only in the translation on the page that I realized, oh, this is what they wanted to say. And I'm just going to show the last page of the poem. So does anyone else want to read, or should I just read it? Let me take hers. Okay, go ahead.
Starting with the Inja or
Manoto.
Manitoba. Man Oto Inja, me and you here, me and you, connected by an O, add another O, and it becomes OO. Third person, genderless. Man, Oto, me, and you.
Would you continue? Just
Man, Oto, O, O, or is it who? Who? Me and you, and a third person, genderless. Row now.
So as we move forward in the poem, they're actually like moving toward introducing the genderless pronoun of the third person in Persian. So oo, which is he, she, they in the singular form, doesn't have gender in Persian, right? So when they say add another O and it becomes OO, but in Persian it's U, third person genderless, right? Man, oto, me and you, man, oto, o, U. So it's like I, you, so first person, second person, and third person. And then they're saying like, this is an this is a genderless pronoun. So the poem is also querying language. It's not just about just like, let's have fun with these two languages and just like playing with the word odor, the word to be, and everything that comes in between, but it's moving towards like this intention of like, let's talk about gender as well. So that's one example of thinking about how the translation can actually be super visible. The translator is the author, is the thinker on the page. And it's also like gesturing towards that chorusless of language. I often talk about this, how my niece, when she started speaking language, she lives in California. She's now 8, but when she started learning language, because in the household, her parents spoke Persian, but everything else was English around her, right? So she didn't have a sense that these are two languages, and she used the grammatical rules of both languages in both languages. So for her, it was just like one whole body of language. And the moment she started going to kindergarten, she started realizing that these are two separate spaces, and soon there were corrections made, right? There are still like moments where the words get mixed up. So she speaks Pinglish, for example, right? But it's not as porous as it was in the beginning. So it's like, we learn to separate them. But what if we actually unlearn this separatedness? And I think this poem is a good example of that. There are other poets who do this kind of work, maybe like in simpler ways, and but also in amazing ways, thinking about what it means to be a person living in diaspora, or to have all these languages and cultures in your body. And one is Solmaz Sharif, whose book Look, Customs are great examples of that. And a younger writer whose first book just came out a few months ago, Nilufar Karimi, and the title of the book is Nuclear Deal. And it's interesting that both like Sharif and Karimi are thinking about like language of military and governments and political institutions, why they're thinking about their bodies in this country. Yeah. But another text that I wanted, I can't share this because this is a whole PDF, but I'm going to share my screen. Is this new book? I mentioned this in workshop shortly yesterday. Conquest, collection of poems by Arash Allahverdi, who is actually like a not really officially legally published poet, except for one book. They published their work underground a lot, translated by Ali Araghi, who's also a writer himself. His novel Immortals of Tehran came out in 2020. But what is interesting with this book is that the book has two sections. So in the first section of the book, we just get what we expect of a traditional book of translation. These are just poems that Ali has translated, and we see the English equivalents, right? But then the second half of the book, which is what I'm very much interested in, is these. So it's like an en face translation. So we have both the Persian and the English, but there is more. What Ali does is he gives us a lot of marginal information. And I'm going to explain what these are in a second. So the first thing that happens is visually, it's all about visibility of the process of translation, right? It's not just like a clear offering of here is the original, here is the translation. But there is, maybe someone would try to read a section of this as an example.
Sure. Just start at the top there. He could hardly see a thing. She was pale as plaster. She kicked the blanket off, jolted up with disheveled hair, and cried, "Blood! Oh God, blood!" Keep going. I warmed the tremble of your hand. It was cold and dark, evil of the dark, evil of the witchcraft.
Okay, let's pause here. So it's interesting that you just like decided to read the poem and disregard like everything else around it. Right, that's true. No, that's true. But yeah. But was there the desire to go there, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you see, like from the title, there is like a comment. The original title is a word that came to Persian from Arabic. It refers to the first rays of the light that make the end of night. The word is also the title of the 113th chapter of the Quran. Daybreak is one of the shortest chapters, and many children memorize it in their young age. This means that the Quranic connotation of the title of this poem is easy to pick up on, right? So there's already like some context about what the original is doing. With the first side note, the original uses an expression similar in meaning to as pale as a sheet, as pale as a ghost, but I thought I would keep the original reference because it points to an interior architectural feature of the region. Most of the inside walls are usually plastered, then painted over. The original expression is his or her complexion is like the plaster on the wall, right? So it's also thinking out loud about the process of translation. Further on, the ones that we see like this, these are actually WhatsApp messages between the poet and the translator. So the translator asks questions about the text, the poet responds, but there are moments in the text exchanges where the poet, for example, says, sorry, the translator, for example, asks, what about this section? And the poet texts back and says, I'm not home right now. It might be like a few hours before I get home to my text. Can you send me the text? Or they make comments about their daughter, like saying something, right? So it's also relational, right? It's about like, how do these two people exchange like information, and what kind of things do they talk about? And then there are moments where, let's see if I can find that example. There are moments where Ali, the translator, actually starts to think, starts to think about the own associations they have with the words, their own personal internal thoughts. So for example, there is one scene where there is a mention of a bomb or something, and then the translator has a comment about, I can't translate this line and not think about my childhood when I was growing up under the Iran-Iraq war and like the bombs falling onto the city. So it just like explodes into this like multi-dimensional world rather than just like a poem existed, now is a faithful translation of that poem in this other language. And I just love that opening of the world and the conversation. It becomes like three-dimensional for me. And they have, I've seen them present this work in conferences where they also like make videos of themselves, like trying to like perform this text as well. How do you perform this? Where would the language go? How would you read it? What kind of like digital presentations of this you can have? So I'm gonna pause the share here. No, I'm not pausing.
Can I say something?
Yes.
It's, first of all, it's really cool. That's really amazing. Thank you for like bringing that in. It's really connected to just, we've been talking about collaboration
Mhm.
a lot. I mean, not just this residency, but really the last three. It's really cool how you have, you know, both the experience of I'm a poet, I'm sitting in my own space,
Mhm.
I'm writing this poem. Asiya, I think, I'm sorry, Asiya, I'm gonna totally mess it up, but it's like with thinking, you were using that phrase, thinking with, I think.
Yeah, thinking with.
So there's a sense when we're writing by ourselves, we're still thinking with we're still in collaboration with others. Which is an experience I think we're all familiar with, but then through the act of translation, it becomes this very collaborative, like, it's not just like, oh, we're collaborating over here and over here I'm by myself. It's like one that gives way to the next, but one that's always been collaborative, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes you're not in conversation with the author. A book I'm working on right now, I have no communication with the author, but I have been talking about that book with another translator, just checking like some phrases or like some choices. And now there is like an editor who also has access to the original language, and while she is reading my translation, like the very rough first draft translation, she's making comments in the margins, and she's very frustrated with the text. It's a text that has a lot of problems narratively for both me and her. And there is like a lot of just like complaining and getting angry, like happening in the margins of those notes, right? It's like, why did he make this comment? Or like, this is not a true representation, or like, what kind of like wording is this, right? So there's like, it's not always like this amicable, like lovely relationship, right? But just like, I love like having that document where the the translator, the editor are actually thinking through this text, right? So again, it's like very process-based.
It's also like a deeply close reading experience.
Yeah.
It's the translator as the close reader.
Yeah, I mean, one of the comments were like, has the author even read this text? Like, has this been edited, right? So it's like in your close reading, you're noticing things that are not really working, right? So that was like the first part of the talk. And for the second half, I wanted to actually I just took some notes last night about these two recent experiences with language and translation that just go beyond what is on the page, and it's just more about like human beings connecting and like how we are all in conversation with one another, or hopefully we are. So I'm just going to read these and then we can talk about them. So these are anecdotes translating as relating. One, in an event, visual artist Molly, who some of you met last winter, and I hold in Brooklyn to raise awareness about women like freedom revolutionary movement in Iran. A few students of mine from Pratt Institute also take part. For two of them, I was their mentor, working with them since they had started their MFAs. One was a student from China, Kay, and the other from Singapore, H. We plan to do readings of texts by Iranian writers or about Iran and do collaborative paintings. Kay signs up to read something. They tell me they have written something about a text I had shared with them. So here's the backstory. When the revolutionary protests in Iran started, a strong, amazing text got published. I think you and I talked about this, first in Persian on social media, by an author simply called L, about the importance of being a body out there in the streets. The title of the piece is Figuring a Women's Revolution, Bodies Interacting with Their Images. It's still one of the best texts written about the protests in the past few months. A while later, this text was translated into English and published in Jadaliya journal. When the English came out, I emailed a link to Kay, who is my student, who is both a writer and an activist, with whom I've had many conversations about displacement, protests, dictatorships, the role of art and the body and writing. They emailed me back and said that they had already read the piece because it had already been translated to Chinese as well and shared among Chinese activists. That was the version that Kay had read. That was not necessarily a surprise because in the height of the street protests this year in fall and winter, there were a lot of transnational activist conversations happening on the ground. Iranians shared on social media safety strategies used by Taiwanese protesters. A Syrian revolutionary wrote a note of advice to Iranians about what mistakes they had made with the Syrian movement and how to avoid them. Songs the Iranians sang in these protests and many before them, some of them were translated versions of songs used in other movements in Italy and Chile many, many years ago. During the protests, women in other countries, including Afghanistan, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Chile, Germany, and many other countries came to the streets singing the slogan of the movement, Woman, Life, Freedom, in their own languages. And it's important to acknowledge that the Persian slogan, Zan Zendegi Azadi, which just translates to Women, Life, Freedom, itself was picked up as translation of the Kurdish slogan, Jen Jian Azadi, which was a slogan used by Kurdish freedom fighters, like the women in the Kurdish regions of Iran, Syria, and Iraq. So the night of the event in Brooklyn, Kay told me what they had written, included notes from that essay by L I had sent them, and they wanted to read those parts in Chinese. They asked me if I would read them in English, so we had like a bilingual reading for those sections. I suggested that they read in Chinese, I read in Persian, and Molly read them in English, so we had all three languages present. Several months later, when Kay submitted their thesis manuscript to me to read, I noticed there was a piece about that night of the event. They had written about the irritating old white man who had once upon a time been in Iran for Peace Corps or something, who read Rumi in translation and insisted on reminding us all that they had been there a long time ago before any of us were born. They had written, Kay had written about the old guy, their irritation with him. They had written about the painting of the pieces and the conversation we had that night. They had written about the fact that they did not expect to cry, but had cried about the fact that I'd been worried about them that night. What Kay did not write about or knew about to write was I had been worried about Kay, the weight of this all on them, but also about my other student who was their age, who had seemed disturbed midway through the night and left early. When I emailed them the next day to check on them, they noted how being from a minority marginalized people in Singapore, they had not expected, had not been comfortable listening to Chinese in that restaurant, cafe in Brooklyn. They had not wanted to expose themselves to that, so they had to leave. They had been shocked by how their body had reacted to the presence of the Chinese language, for them, the language of the oppressor. So that's the first anecdote. Maybe I can pause here, and if anyone wants to make any comments or have any notes. Okay, so I'm gonna read the next one, which is a longer anecdote. Okay, here's how the story begins. I'm in a friend's car and she's driving me to a tow company parking lot so that I can go through a process to pick my car up after it has been, quote, repossessed. The backstory of this I leave for another time. The point is, we are told on the phone that I should bring cash and we should stay in the car and wait for someone to come out of the office and talk to us. So you could imagine the vibe in the car as the two of us were driving there. While this drive is happening in Denver, I also suddenly remember that I have a meeting on Google Meet with an agent in New York, a publishing house editor in France, and an author in Tehran. Let me give the backstory of this meeting as it will be important to the story. I've been editing this column for Word Without Borders, compiling witness narratives from the ongoing revolutionary woman life freedom movement in Iran. I felt while I was not there in the streets to be a witness and a participant, I could curate and translate some of the unique writing that was happening in real time on social media, as well as acquire writing that might not have been yet written, but wants to, or has been written but not published for various reasons, including safety. One of the published pieces, which I read from the night of my reading, a witness narrative, which I read from the night of my reading, was written by an author in Tehran after I reached out to them and asked if they would like to write down something about their experiences while the protests were happening. They said yes. And so they sent me something, which I translated, which was edited by the editors of Word Without Borders and published as anonymous by the author for safety reasons. A while later, I received an email from an editor in Paris who had read the piece in Word Without Borders and was wondering if the author would be interested in turning that piece, that essay, into a book. So from here on, my role shifts from an editor and translator into an agent. I reach back to the author and share the publisher's proposal. They are interested, but there are many. I also have conversations with the agent who has just started working with me for another project to get their input. Now let's go back to the car and the drive to the tow company parking lot. This is the first conversation we are having, the four of us. The fact that the author is showing their face to the publisher and my agent is already a risk to them. The fact that they are having this conversation on an internet, on the Google Meet, is already a risk, even though Google Meet is considered one of the more secure platforms. As my friend is following the Google map, the road takes us to more sketchy parts of Denver. On the side of the highway, car repair shops set up by the road, many trucks around us, auto parts sales, and many parking lots and storages. The 25 minutes my friend Molly is driving on this increasingly shabby road, I'm on the meeting and we are doing the preliminary conversations about this book deal. You would imagine the preliminary conversation would be about the book length, word count, deadline, the financial stuff, but not in this case. Before we get to any of that, actually, we never get to any of that on this call because the editor first wants to clarify a few things. So this is the editor in Paris. They want to make sure that the author knows the risks they are taking and that this can be dangerous and that the publisher will do their best to keep their identity anonymous, but emphasizing that they have no legal power to support them if anything happens, and wants to make sure that the author understands the risks and that even messages and emails could be traced back to them if it comes to it, and whether they would want to publish anonymous and how safe that could be and all that. And with that framing, we are driving toward the parking lot and the author is thinking out loud and wondering whether they would be able to do this. They talk about having a project, a novel that they have been working on, and the only concern they have that they raise is, if I do this and something happens, I wouldn't be able to finish that other book of mine. So we never get to the rest of the conversation. We all know how important this witness narrative is, but we also all want to make sure the author on the ground would stay safe. The funny thing is, at some point in the conversation, the author even mentions that they wouldn't want to put me in danger because my name would also be on the book. But of course, I have to remind them that for me, that ship has already sailed with the publication of my own book a few years back. And for those of you who don't know, after I published my book, I have not been able to go back to Iran just for safety reasons. By the time we get to the address of the tow company parking lot, my friend parks on a dusty roadside area and waits there for a few more minutes for me to finish the meeting. And when I do, she just keeps looking at me for a few minutes, having witnessed that conversation. This was a very intense drive. It takes us some more minutes to be able to locate the office for the tow company. It has an almost invisible sign. The windows are all covered with fences, and we have to sit there for a while waiting for someone to come talk to us without us getting out of the car. And then the person gets the cash from us and she disappears into the parking lot only to come back with the car in a few more minutes. Following that meeting, the author has a few others with me, asking for my thoughts, thinking through things with me. So in those conversations, there was a lot of responsibility of like, do you think I should do this? Do you think it would be safe? And anything I would say, if something happened to them, that would be also like my responsibility. So we had all those conversations. A few days later, even before the deadline for making a decision to the French publisher, the author texts me and tells me they're going to do it. They say, how can I not do this? Something about not forgiving themselves if they don't do it. A contract is signed, but even figuring the financial stuff is complicated. The French publisher can't send money to the author in Iran. They have to find a way to send it to me, and then I have to find a way to just somehow give the money to them in Iran. The publisher wants to publish a French translation in September. So this conversation was in March. The author goes to the countryside in Tehran, cuts themselves off the internet, spends a few weeks writing the book-length essay that needed to be written, and turned the first draft to me. So now I become the editor again. So even though the book did not yet have an English publisher, I was contracted to read the Persian and work with the author as an editor of the original. We go back and forth for 2 rounds of extensive edits and many in-depth conversations. Besides elements of craft and clarity and usual editorial notes, the main topic of conversation was how could the author, consider their non-Iranian audience without explaining the text too much. So even though they were writing it in Persian, they were already thinking of a non-Iranian audience. So that's already translation. Mm-hmm. Even before the process of interlingual translation started, the translation had already started. The French editor publisher, without having read the whole book, upon trust of the original excerpt, found a French translator and passed them on the text to be translated in a matter of only 3 weeks. A British publisher then signed on for the English rights. They want to publish in October, so I only have 3 weeks to turn in my translation, mid-July. The reason I started by sharing this is to share the amount of non-linguistic, off-the-page work that goes into the work of translation. From an editor to a translator to an agent to a trusted friend to a publisher, consultant to an editor again to then again a translator. The emotional and ethical responsibility that goes into this process. At some point, I even contacted PEN America to ask about their conditions for supporting writers in danger and what they could do in case something happens to the author in Iran. It's important to remember what the languages on the 2 sides of the equation are when it comes to translation. the stories of translation between European languages and English are quite different from the story you just heard. But I also wanted to tell this story to say that in this whole process, the final product, having the book in translation published, is only part of why I find value in translating. The other part of it, if not more important, at least as important, is the relationships that have been built around this work. The kind of care that the author and I have extended to one another, with the words being not just the reason, but also the vessel for this care. The care the publisher, editor in Paris, and the agent, who is not even the agent for the author or this project, have shown for the work and for the author. Yes, the book is important, but there has been more than that. The process has also been important because it has allowed me to experience what has been going on in my country on another level. When your body is not there, your only way to experience this is through mediations of the others, through translations of others and your own translations of their translations. So I'm gonna stop here. And we can open it to questions, conversations.
I have a question,
Mhm.
and also thank you. I'm just thinking about how this program has expanded my idea of what counts as translation, and we talked a lot this week about translating things just by having them pass through us, and that being a form of translation. And then quote about Don Quixote has come up a couple times. So I'm wondering, as a person who's doing that kind of translation and also language to language translation, how are those processes similar and different for you? And maybe as a bodily experience, but also just like a thought experiment. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I also feel like that any kind of writing I do is translation, right? It's any writing is translation, right? It's like the experience of the world outside going through your body, and then you are translating it through your own tissues, your own background, even the present moment you're in, and then offering it back to the world, right? So that's already a process of translation. But as I said, it's like even with linguistic translation, I do a lot of like the so-called traditional translation, right? But I'm more and more drawn to like the possibilities of the non-traditional translation. Kasher, the first poet whose work we looked at, in one of their interviews, like conversations, they were talking about how frustrated they are when people say something is not translatable or this is untranslatable. And they're like, that's just because you're not creative enough, right? What if you just like think about like, think outside the box, right? And everything becomes translatable, right? So I've been saying with that comment since I heard it, like, yeah, maybe like I can't translate this in a traditional sense of like translating a text, but what if, right? But like that, what if, even the magnets that Molly and I have been doing, we see that as a process of translation, right? Because it's like the two of us sit together over dinner, over tea, we read passages from a book, we have conversations about them, and then we sit together, we paint, right? And then it goes into like the Adobe, we work on it, and then it goes to a company, they translate it into this other form, right? So it's all of it is just like transformation, right? So it's not just about like, oh, let's produce this work. It's like, what's the process of producing this work, right? And we talked about this in workshop, like the idea of workmanship of risk, right? Versus of workmanship of certainty. And I just more and more drawn to this idea of like risk taking in the creative process in the art world, right? And that's distinction between workmanship of risk and workmanship of certainty comes from actually a book of translation memoir, This Little Art, by Kate Briggs, which is about the process of translating Ronald Barthes, but she actually starts writing about that process. It's an amazing book to help us think about like what it means to be in conversation with other thinkers and writers and to think through language. So they are different in the sense that, like, let's say with this novel, right? I'm not really drawn to the story. There are a lot of like problems with that narrative that I don't really like, right? Even thinking about why that book has been picked up for translation, right? The choices by the Western publishers, right? The book has already been translated into French, into Italian, right? So the English is coming. And even like the editor and I talk about like, is it ethical for us to actually help bring this work into the English language, right? I mean, she has already decided she doesn't want her name to be in the book. But there you are more bound to the original, right? It's like you have to tell the story that the author is telling, right? But I'm thinking that, well, I can't do anything in that project, but I can write an essay about the process of doing that translation, right? So it's just like just creating these constellations of thinking through and making all processes transparent.
I was just thinking about how translation, literature and translation, the act of translation, you're thinking about sharing your thinking about translation. Alejandro has done this before in this program. We have a person coming, I think in January, a new faculty member, Lara Mimosa Montes, who also thinks a lot about translation. And how, you know, it sort of invites us to think about the porousness of languages, right? That thin membrane, but looming around this is nationhood, right? And I think about Dion Brand and the map to the door of no return. Notes on Belonging, she really does so much in that book, but one of the things she does is really question and problematize nationhood. And the way that can also then play out in the diaspora, you know, and it makes me think about how nationhood as a, like, you know, and it just inherently invites this kind of imperial impulse, you know, that we, the artists, have to sort of like, you know, essentially work against, you know, to sort of keep that porosity, to keep us thinking about the porosity, I guess. Yeah. I mean, the danger that you're describing is really extraordinary. Just to note that, you know, and the position that you are putting yourself in and have put yourself in is really like incredible.
Right, but I want to acknowledge that I'm not in more danger because of this one project, right? It's the author who is taking that risk, right?
Yeah.
And when the French publisher, like, they texted me later and they were like, because the author was like, well, maybe this won't sell that much, maybe it won't even be seen, right? But I want to write it. And then I told the publisher that like a version of that comment, and they were like, we are publishing like 25,000 copies of that book in the first round.
Wow.
And then I was like, okay, so there's no way it's not going to be, you know, seen.
That's a lot of copies for those of you who don't in the literary world. For those of you who know.
Yeah, and just the fact that, like, I mean, in the US, I haven't worked like with like more mainstream like publishers. But just the fact that they are trusting an author and a translator to just do this work and they're planning on it for a September publication without even having read the full manuscript. Like from March to September, that's just 6 months. I mean, they have their marketing reasons, right? September is the anniversary of the protests. It's the anniversary of Maxwell being killed. So there is a marketing plan behind it, right? But just like to trust a text and see the potential in it. I think that's also an important aspect of this constellation around this work. And the text also like is itself interesting because in the text, the author is not just thinking about the present moment, but also looking back at like one of the early poets in Iranian history who was also an outlaw, so it's like also thinking across time, right? It's like, when did this women's movement start? And what was the role of poetry back then? What is the role of language now? So it's like across time and across space, right? So there is also translation happening in the original text in that sense, right? It's like she's identifying with Tahir Oratoleh, the poet, and seeing a continuation in that ancestry of like language and fighting for freedom and women's rights.
I'm thinking about how like fundamental the act of translation is in resistance. I think that's what you're talking. You think of like the sharing of strategies and slogans and resources, and how I think the status quo would have us believe that it is too difficult, and that it is maybe less fluid than it can be. So yeah, I'm just really struck by the idea of translation is like more accessible than we think it is, and just really fundamental to resistance and like community like throughout the world.
And that ties back to the idea of nationhood, right? And what the systems of government and like the regimes of politics want us to think, right? One of the things that I keep telling my students in the past year is the main narrative we hear is like, this is a revolutionary movement in Iran. But there are so many intersections with what is happening here in the US, what is happening in Latin America, what is happening in China, in Taiwan, in all countries around. So it's like, rather than like one people against one country, it's like just one people, especially younger generations, against just like these old patriarchal, like corrupt systems of government. But that larger narrative stops people from seeing that as an interconnected revolutionary movement, which I think is just the key to like all our resistances.
And also our inability to communicate. I think especially in America, there's many people aren't multilingual. It's more common in other countries to be multilingual. And so, yeah, imperialism, right? Like if you can't communicate with other people, you can't be in conversation with them. And I think your point, Maya, was like so brilliant, right? Like the inability to communicate is actually that power system putting a blockade in front of you very intentionally.
Yeah, but I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, it's also like a lot of people around the world are constantly translating themselves into English for reasons of like wanting to be heard, right?
Yeah.
So even like in 2009, or like thinking again about translation, in 2009 protests, when citizen journalism started in Iran, the way people recorded video was very different from how they do it now. Like in the beginning, it was just like, here's a video, I'm just gonna send it out. But now it's like, here's the location, here's the time, here is like the exact moment, right? And then that is immediately translatable as well, right? Like Instagram and other platforms like Twitter, they just do the translation, right? They don't do a good job of it, right? But the AI is giving you a sense of what is going on. And then there is like also like the more complicated translation. So for example, with that SAL, right, it was just like volunteers translated it because they were like, this is important to be read, not just for us, but for like other movements around the world, right? And that happened with a lot of like other, especially like texts that were about like gender rights and like women's rights, right? That got translated by volunteer translators and just like put out there. So it's not just like the immediate language that is translated, it's like longer thinking that is also like in a way like activist translation, right? Questions from the Zoom world?
Mika, I wasn't surprised that Mika had some really a nice post in the comments. Mika's work is similar to that, you know, the translation with all of the,
Yeah.
We were speaking about that yesterday.
yeah.
Okay.
All right, let's get
Thanks,
Poupeh.
everyone.